edges to present something that isn't going to threaten the status quo. Because let's remember what's going on here. I mean, people need to sort of get in the way back machine and remember that you had, again, the civil rights movement, and you also had the Cold War, and you had the Vietnam War.
Right.
There was a constant anxiety among, people like J. Edgar Hoover, people like Richard Nixon, that sort of hardcore right wing of the establishment, that the communists, subversives are going to use popular culture to undermine American values, to undermine American society,
right?
On and on.
And do you think there can be something to that, though?
Well, you see, the thing is that whose values are being undermined? You know what I'm saying? Mm. You need to sort of step back in some ways, because there is this whole list, that being a rock and roll star, particularly a charismatic rock and roll star, was a very dangerous occupation for a very long time. And at the very least, you're going to be watched by the FBI. Somebody's going to create a file on you. You might be harassed. Chuck Berry is another one who sort of put out of circulation. He's arrested. There's a drug bust. There are lots of things that you can do, stopping short of assassination. I know, particularly when I was growing up, there was, people were constantly talking about, conspiracies against people like John Lennon, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, and things like that. Mm. And certainly, I think that with John Lennon and Jimi Hendrix, it's not theoretical. Jimi Hendrix, it's pretty clear by now, was murdered. Mm. He was murdered by his manager, who was afraid that he was going to break off with him. But at the same time, the manager had very, very shady connections to all sorts of people. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And I think, it's interesting. So there is this struggle to, keep the counterculture in its place, and that when it picks up steam, when it snowballs, to co-opt it. And this goes all the way up to the grunge era. And we don't really see, the other thing that you have to understand too is that back, certainly in the 50s, the record industry was not what it is now, where it's, there's 5 or 6 companies that are all parts of huge conglomerations that control the entire music industry. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of independent labels. I mean, you had people just selling records out of the back of trucks at concerts. It wasn't organized. It was very provisional. But with each passing year, the record industry, the established labels, the Columbias, the Mercurys, Philips, RCA, all these major labels that were selling Frank Sinatra records, were selling Elvis Presley records, all these sort of things, they start signing rock and roll bands, pretty early on. Mm. And I would say by the mid-'70s is when the record industry really has the upper hand. That the record industry itself is determining what will be popular, what gets played, what gets put down. And from that point, it's just, the 80s in a lot of ways were a joke. I mean, you had phony bands being created by producers, one after another. Right. And by the end of the 80s, I mean, it's one fake group after another, or one fake star, or one fake singer. Then we have the whole pop revival. And then dance music comes in, where one musician producer can decide pretty much everything that gets played, because they, the producers are also musicians. They're also the composers. You had the sort of explosion in the late 60s that the establishment and the record industry weren't really aware how to deal with. But again, by the early 70s and into the mid 70s, they're back in control. And I think the control, just with each passing year, becomes tighter and tighter. But at the same time, I mean, the thing that people, you can look at all that stuff, and I do touch upon some of this in the book, but I think there are also different powers at work here. Good music is its own power. Music, I've always said that music writes itself. The music is in control.
Right.
And any musician out there is going to know exactly what I'm talking about. You can't force a good music. When I hear songs on the radio, I can just feel them struggling. I'm just they're not in touch with the muse. They're not in touch with the source of music. They're not in touch with the power of music.
Yeah.
And it's interesting as well because I think that I've always said that the muses choose broken vessels because, musicians themselves can be very difficult people to deal with. I mean, in some ways, when you look at a lot of people who have died young in rock and roll, two things you have to take into account here. One is the incredible pressures that the music industry puts them under, which always translates into just rampant drug abuse. And second of all, I mean, a lot of these people are kind of marginal personalities. I mean, a lot of these people are difficult. I mean, I grew up in a family of musicians, and I can sort of attest to this. It's not I would not choose, if I had it all over to do again, I would not be, choose to be raised by a musician. But again, I mean, the music industry, I was a musician for a while. I was in groups. I was doing all this stuff. But I realized that the music industry is just, it's a bad thing.
It is.
I mean it.
It is.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It
takes people in, it chews them up and spits them out, all drained as well, for those few who actually make it,
Yeah, I mean, one of the really good things I like about the internet is that it's taken off that filtering mechanism that the major radio companies had.
Yes.
And in some ways have, for people who still listen to the radio. One of the worst things about the music industry is how it filters out 99% of great music out there,
yeah.
of music that is truly in touch with that source, that energy that is musical, true musical power. Because often these people are hard to deal with. They're erratic. They're not willing to be marketed. They're not willing to be ripped off. I mean, that's a big thing, Certainly in the 80s, where, you had basically, in the mid-80s, where every radio station was playing the same thing. It was playing the same songs, with very little variation, that there was very little difference between what your pop stations and your rock stations were playing. This is when the radio programmers really took hold, really take over. And, it was awful. and I think what we saw with indie and the alternative scene was very much a reaction against that, because the thing is that, like I said, music itself is a living energy. And when you try to control it, you kill it.
Yep, that is
and
right.
You basically parade around its corpse. I mean, that's basically how I see it. That you cannot dictate where music is going to go. It has, it's like a river that's going to choose its own path.
That's right. I totally agree with that. And I think also that's why, producers and things like that, they are obviously, they're aware of the fact that they are not in contact with the muse in most cases. And therefore they will, that's when the whole rip-off thing comes into the picture as well, that we have all these young, maybe, aspiring musicians out there who are writing, great music, or at least they're tapping into something which is unique that these record, producers and people who write the songs actually need, because in most cases they drain themselves. And we have all these people, at least in the past now then, they want to, get a contract, they want to get signed on a label or something. And they're sending all this great music into basically these record companies, and the chances are, very, very big that you're going to be ripped off in one way or another. And that also kind of gets us into this other interesting aspect, because you mentioned the muse before and tapping into creativity and what that actually is. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think that is? Do you think that there could be archetypal forces within the music that are coming through, that the qualities, if you will, of the ancient gods are coming through both musicians, but also in one way the music that they write? And ultimately, what do you think that the people are seeking, that are either playing it or listening to it? Is this a spiritual thing? Is this a modern version then of the old mystery cults, in that sense, that this is a spiritual thing? You're trying to connect with, archetypal forces in the universe. What do you think, Chris?
Oh, I totally agree with that. And that's basically what the book is about. It's very, there are two ways to sort of look at the ancient gods. One, you can sort of look at them that people took this all literally, and, they told these stories and they believed them literally. I mean, maybe that was true with, certain people, but I think a lot of people understood that this was archetype, that this was symbol, that this was all trying to encapsulate things in allegory that defy, rationality, that defy linear explanation. And I think with rock and roll, this whole recycling of archetypes, for the most part, that I talk about in the books, and that, certain groups, certain kinds of groups are tapping into these archetypal energies. 99.9% of the time, this is a completely unconscious process. I mean, this is a process that has its own rules, has its own way of controlling the outcome. And it's fascinating to me that when I was reading about the ancient mystery cults, when I was really doing the research on this, not only did it remind me of modern rock, or, the classic era of rock, let's say, but it also reminded me of voodoo or Santeria. The parallels there are stunning, but also Pentecostalism and charismatic Christianity. I love good old time gospel music, the real fast. I mean, to me, it's like hardcore punk. It's about speed. It's about energy. It's about catharsis. You see these churches and these people are going crazy. I mean, they losing their minds because all those frustrations and disappointments and sorrows are all being released in this context. And I think that is really what we saw in the ancient mystery cult. But no, I mean, really what I wanted to explore in this book is exactly why rock and roll is so much like Santeria, why it's so much like voodoo, why it's so much like Pentecostalism. The good stuff, the real stuff. There is the phony, boring corporate rock, that, what can you say about it? But the real McCoy, the people who are really in touch with his energy, the release, catharsis, that intensity that suits this very deep human need that people lose sight of, people sort of tend to be embarrassed by. But I think when you get into that realm, that there are archetypal energies waiting for you.
Yep.
That are going to tell their stories through you. And that's really what I'm saying here, is that you had people like Jim Morrison who really understood this stuff. Jim Morrison knew who Dionysus was. He understood this history.